So far we discussed about types of flowers. Next let us study about pollination. So what is pollination? See, while discussing about the parts of flower, that the flower has petal, sepals, then reproductive organs like stamen and carpel or pistil, isn't it? So this is the male reproductive organ, that is stamen. So this is the anther. It is the bilobed structure, means it has two compartments. Each is divided into two sacs. So each sac contains yellow powdery substance called pollen grains, isn't it? So these are pollen grains. So these pollen grains are motile, in the sense they can move. They can be carried from one flower to the another flower. And this is the female reproductive part, that is carpel or pistil. So this basal portion is the ovary. So inside the ovary there is ovule and small bead-like structures are present. They are called as egg or ovum. So this is egg or ovum, and this is the topmost region of the pistil or carpel, that is stigma. This is the stigma. This is style. This is the ovary. And inside what is present? Egg or ovum. This is anther. This is the filament. Okay. So, as I said, these pollen grains are motile, means they can be carried from one flower to the another flower. But this egg or ovum is non-motile, in the sense it cannot move. So, and also we have discussed that what is fertilization? Fertilization is the process of fusion of male and female gamete, isn't it? Fusion of male and female gamete. So both male and female gamete has to fuse together. So female gamete is here. It is present in the ovule. So male gamete is pollen grain. It is present in the anther. So these pollen grains need to be transferred to the stigma of the flower. Okay. These pollen grains are need to be transferred to the stigma of the flower. So once they reach the stigma of the flower, what happens? They travel through the style. Okay. Then they reach the ovule. Here they fuse with the egg. Pollen grains are male gamete. They fuse with the female gamete, that is egg, inside the ovule. So fusion of male and female gamete takes place. So later on, what happens? So this is the first step of seed formation. So what happens after fertilization, means fusion of male and female gamete? These ovary changes to fruit, and the ovule, this inside, what is there, the ovule, this changes as seed. This becomes seed, isn't it? So from that seed we get new plants. So that is reproduction. So here what happens? In order to fertilization to take place, what should be done? These pollen grains should be transferred to the stigma of the flower. Okay. So this transfer, okay, this transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. That is called as pollination. Okay. So this process is called as pollination. Transfer of pollen grains. Okay. Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. So this process is called as pollination. So what is pollination? So pollination means transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. Is called as pollination. So what is pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. So in the anther, pollen grains are present. Pollen grains are male gametes. They have to be transferred to the female gamete. They need to reach the female gamete, that is female reproductive part, carpel or pistil. So these transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. So this pollination is the first step of seed formation, because once the pollen grains reach the stigma, they travel through the style and they reach the ovule. Then fusion of male and female gamete takes place. Then it changes into seed, isn't it? So this is the first step of seed formation. From that seed, we get new plants. So this process is called pollination. So here, who will transfer these pollen grains from anther to the stigma? Let us see. Process of pollination. So, while discussing about the parts of a flower, we discussed about petals, isn't it? So, what are petals? They are the colored attractive part of the plant, isn't it? Sorry, colored attractive part of the flower. And also they have sweet smell, isn't it? So, and while discussing, we have discussed that these petals, what is their function? They attract insects towards the flower, isn't it? Why do they attract insect? Because to carry this process, pollination. So, who will do this process? Who will transfer these pollen grains from one flower to the another? That is through the insects. Okay. So, here what happens is these flowers, they produce a sweet liquid called as nectar. Okay. Sweet liquid called as nectar. So, what is this? Sweet liquid. Sweet liquid produced in the flower. Produced in flower. Sweet liquid produced in flower. So, insects like honeybee, then butterfly, small birds like hummingbirds. So, you might have observed these insects and birds, they visit the flower, isn't it? To suck the nectar. Nectar is their food. This nectar, sweet liquid produced in the flower, is their food. So, to suck the nectar, they visit your garden, isn't it? They sit on the flowers. So, while sucking the nectar from the flower, what happens is, these pollen grains from the anther will stuck to the body parts of these insects like wings, legs and tiny hairs present on their body. So these pollen grains will stuck to their body parts. And from this flower, they move to the another flower of the same plant. So when they move to the another flower, what happens? These pollen grains will fall on the stigma of that another flower. Okay. So this is the anther. Here pollen grains are present. So insect or honeybee sit on this flower. So these pollen grains, they are motile. They can be carried from one flower to the another, isn't it? So these pollen grains will stuck to their wings or their beak or tiny hairs present on their body. So it will stuck to their body parts. Then they'll move to the another flower. Take that, it is female flower. Like this. So then when they sit on the another flower, these pollen grains will fall on the stigma of that flower. Okay. It falls on the stigma of that flower. So this is how the transfer of pollen grains takes place. From anther to the stigma of another flower. Okay. So once it reaches the stigma, it travels through the style, then it reaches ovule. There fusion of male and female gamete takes place. Later on it changes into seed and fruit. Isn't it? So this is how transfer of pollen grains from one flower to stigma of another flower takes place. So here, who will take part in the process of pollination? Insects like butterfly, honeybee, then small birds like hummingbird, animals like bat. They take part in the process of pollination. Hence, they are called as agents of pollination. Okay, they are called as agents of pollination. So they carry pollen grains from one flower anther to the stigma of another flower. So they are the agents of pollination. Butterfly, honeybee, then hummingbird. So these are the agents of pollination. So they, while sucking nectar, the pollen grains will stuck to their body parts. When they reach the another flower, these pollen grains will fall on the stigma of that flower. So this is how they transfer pollen grains from one flower to the stigma of another flower. So hence they are called the agents of pollination, and the process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower is called as pollination. So this is how pollination takes place. I hope you understood. Thank you.